And as Deb said, I am the Assistant Director of JPPM, and I will be your moderator for this evening's virtual presentation. Before we begin, I'm going to start with some housekeeping, as we all do in virtual meetings. This lecture will be recorded, and it may be shared through social media or our website. So if you have your camera on, you will be part of the digital recording. So I'll ask you to make sure to mute your audio so as to not interfere with the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to enter them into the chat. The chat button can be found at the bottom right of your screens. It's the little icon that looks like a triangle, square, and circle. So there's a Q&A in there, and then the little chat window, the little speech bubble, that's your chat box. So you can put something in either one of those. It's entirely up to you. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. During the Q&A, you can raise your hand or enter questions into the chat. To raise your hand, you select the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. So if you have that little menu bar at your bottom, it's a little hand that looks just like that. Click on that and a little hand will appear on your screen. It will know that you have a question. When I call on you, you can unmute yourself and ask your question, but don't forget to remute yourself when you are done. And if anybody has any questions right now, you can go ahead and enter them into the chat, and we will work through those right now for you. Otherwise, I will introduce our guest for this evening. Aaron Deter-Wolf is a prehistoric archaeologist with the Tennessee Division of Archaeology in Nashville, where his work includes managing archaeological sites on state-owned lands and conducting excavations and research. Over the past decade, Mr. Deter-Wolf has been a leading researcher in developing the archaeological study of tattooing, including identifying tattooing tools in archaeological collections, documenting tattoos on mummified human remains, and experimental archaeology recreating and testing ancient and historic tattooing implements. He shares information about the history of tattooing and body modification on his Instagram account at Archaeology Inc., which I believe he will be able to show you on his title slide. Tonight, Mr. Deter-Wolf will tell us about some of the archaeological evidence of the last 5,000 year of the at least 5,000-year-old global practice of tattooing. Despite how long tattooing has been practiced, the identification of evidence of tattooing in the archaeological record is relatively recent. In tonight's presentation, Mr. Deter-Wolf will discuss how archaeologists uncover and interpret evidence of tattooing and describe recent discoveries from North America and beyond. Mr. Deter-Wolf, thank you for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you all so much for having me. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the folks that have come out to their computers tonight to see this. We here in Middle Tennessee, we have seasonal allergies all the time, basically. We're kind of in a basin here in Nashville, and so it's now time for our fall allergy season. And as a result, I'm kind of hoarse tonight, and of course, that's kind of alarming when you hear me cough. But anyway, there may be some times during the presentation where I have to mute it and sort that out. So just FYI. So as was mentioned, I am an archaeologist with the state of Tennessee's Division of Archaeology. My daily work and most of my research focus is on ancient Native American sites in Tennessee and the southeastern United States. That said, as an archaeologist and as a member of the tattoo community, I am interested in how we understand tattooing and other body modification practices in ancient and historical societies. And I'm particularly interested in the material culture of these practices, the artifacts of tattooing and how we identify them. And this has led to now over a decade of research, starting in the American Southeast and then expanding gradually to become a worldwide interest. And along the way has led to some interesting discoveries, and I'll talk with you some about those tonight. Two things before we get started. First, please be aware that this presentation includes images of archaeological human remains from outside of North America. And secondly, what I know about tattooing and tattoo history is mostly thanks to the good work of other people, right? Of my collaborators, my friends, Indigenous scholars, archaeologists, anthropologists, and of course, the tattoo community and tattoo artists who have worked with me over the years. And there are too many of these folks to name, but I am and I remain grateful for all of the support and assistance that they've given me over the years. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen with you. Let's see if we can get here. All right, and can someone log in there on the microphone and tell me if you can see the slide?
Can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so in our modern mainstream culture, tattooing tends to be regarded in terms of its recent Western history. And a lot of the media coverage you read about tattooing, whether it's tattoo trends or new styles or the tattoos on the Kardashian family or whatever it is, tends to include some variation of the conceit that tattoos have entered the mainstream, or that tattoos are not just for sailors and criminals anymore. And the idea that tattooing was ever just the realm of sailors and criminals is actually really bad history. As my friend and a fantastic historian Matt Loder says, tattooing is a medium, it's not a phenomenon. And for thousands of years, cultures across the globe have tattooed their bodies. And that process of putting ink in skin has mostly not been decorative or purely decorative, but was an essential part of the cultural heritage of hundreds or maybe even thousands of societies over time. That said, the modern Western view of the past and how we picture the lives of ancient and historical peoples is very sanitized and tends to be seen through our own biases. I'm sure most of you over your lives have gone to museums where you've seen these dioramas, these reproductions of historical life or life in the ancient past. And until very recently, most of those reproductions included indigenous or non-Western bodies, but those were generally shown unmarked, without any sort of tattooing or body painting or permanent body modification. As just an example of this, as we come into the fall and you're getting ready for the Thanksgiving holiday, consider the image of the first Thanksgiving, the first American Thanksgiving, which most of us were raised with. And that's sort of exemplified by this early 20th century painting. And there are a lot of things wrong with this painting, right? I mean, we could spend an hour picking apart the details of this thing. But what I want to focus on here is the Native American bodies and the fact that they are unmarked. Now, that is how we may view in our minds the first Thanksgiving in the Plymouth colony. And but just 13 years after this event, in 1630, William Wood, in talking about the Wampanoag who lived near the Plymouth plantation, writes this: "Many of the better sort, bearing upon their cheeks certain portraitures of beasts and bears and deers and moose and wolves, which are not a superficial painting, but a certain incision, or else a railing of their skin by a sharp instrument, under which they convey a certain kind of black unchangeable ink, which makes the desired form apparent and permanent." Now, Wood doesn't yet have the word tattoo, and we'll come back to that here in a second, but it's clear that what he's talking about is permanent body modification. And that right there gives you I think, a much different version of the first Thanksgiving than we might otherwise have. The Wampanoag were not alone in their tattooing traditions. The earliest visual depictions and the earliest historical records of the New World consistently describe tattooing among Native American groups throughout the Eastern Woodlands. The folio of the English artist John White, which you see a couple examples of here, is very explicit in its depiction of tattoos of Algonquin speakers from the Carolinas. And in his folio, White actually goes out of his way to juxtapose these tattooed Native American bodies with images of the painted pics of British history. And art historians think that White was doing this in an effort to show that Native Americans were civilized and trustworthy, in fact, perhaps more peaceful than Britain's own ancestors in the Picts and the Celts. So this pattern of recording tattoos on Native Americans in the Eastern Woodlands continues throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. You don't have to scratch very far into the art historical or historical record to find these references. But none of these references include the word tattoo. That is because the term tattoo as a reference to putting ink in skin doesn't enter the European lexicon until after the voyages of Captain Cook to the Pacific, so in the late 18th century. Tattooing was not new to Europeans when they arrived in North America or South America or the Pacific or Africa. We have good historical data at this point to show that tattooing was practiced throughout Europe prior to the so-called Age of Discovery. But before the late 18th century, they were using different terms. The English were using things like ponce and stamp and embroider, the French verb piquer, the Spanish labrar. So there are different terms that were being used. It's after Cook's voyage to the Pacific and that encounter that the adopted Polynesian term tattoo comes to symbolize and stand for all permanent skin marking in the European lexicon. There's a history there that sometimes you'll find online that says that tattooing was introduced to Europe following Cook's voyages, that this was the first time that tattooing was seen and they carried back these traditions to Europe. As I said, we know that's not good history now. The sailors on Cook's voyage were in fact probably tattooed themselves. Interestingly, after that encounter, it appears that European tattooing remained pretty much unchanged. They didn't adopt the imagery or the techniques or tools of Pacific tattooing. Instead, they adopted the word or the root word to tattoo. So I mentioned that the Wampanoag were not alone. And here you can see very clearly that all of these groups that are identified on the map have historical records of having tattooed between the 16th and the early 20th century. When you break it out like this, it's almost like we shouldn't be asking who did tattoo in Native North America. We should be asking who didn't. These traditions, unfortunately, went away very quickly in the eastern woodlands. In our region, they were extinguished or suppressed by about the mid-18th century due to acculturative forces. The traditions persist to a greater or lesser extent on the eastern plains until the early 20th century. And this same basic pattern occurs at the global level as well. Written documents give evidence of historical tattoo traditions all over the world dating back to at least 500 BC. And this is not a comprehensive map. This is a work in progress. This is something that colleagues and I are constantly expanding. I feel very strongly that a lot of these regions that are not highlighted in green will be eventually. It's just a matter of finding the sources. Now, these same historical records give us a view as to why tattooing traditions existed and how marked bodies acted in their various societies. I mentioned earlier how in our Western tattooing tradition, we think of tattoos as being something that is self-selected, of being imagery that is personal, that we choose ourselves. But this was rarely the case from a historical perspective. And instead, when you look at the grand scope of tattooing in the historical record, most tattoos were tied into the very fabric of society in which individuals lived. So tattoos were intimately connected cross-culturally to things like rites of passage. Tattoos were given to people when they reached adulthood, when they achieved group membership. They signified that they were, by virtue of being full members of the society, able to engage in warfare or marry or have children. One example of this among the Hidatsa in North Dakota in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when young men went on their vision quests, they would encounter or discover their personal guardian spirit, their Manitou. And the symbols of that Manitou were then marked on their bodies after that quest was complete as tattoos. And so this individual, this warrior named Poor Wolf or Lean Wolf, on his quest, he encountered a raptor as his Manitou. And so the symbols of that raptor, the tail feathers, and there on his hand, the claw, were tattooed on him when he came home then. Cross-culturally, tattoos are tied into achievement and status. They mark visibly the things that individuals have earned or accomplished, or in some cases, the things their ancestors earned and accomplished. This man is from the Kalinga of the Philippines, and the Kalinga are a headhunting tribe. And prior to the 20th century, men's tattoos were earned by virtue of their valor on the battlefield or on raiding. And specifically, tattoos were earned by the number of heads that a warrior had taken. And so as you accumulated heads and accumulated honor, your tattoos expanded across your body. And so this is a very visual mark and identity of your value to the community. Across cultures, tattoos are very much connected to spirituality, and particularly to animist religions. In those religions, they frequently allow for the capture and redirection of spiritual forces. So, for example, the Sakyant tradition in Thailand is made up of literal magic spells that are inscribed in ink and oil onto the bodies of the recipient. And those spells endow that recipient with abilities and with traits and with value that is based on the power of the spell, the spiritual power of the monk who's doing it, of the monk's teachers, of the ingredients in the ink, and in some cases, the value and power of those spells depends on how the tattooed individual holds to the precepts of Buddhism. So they're connected to the lived experience, but also to the afterlife. All around the world, we find examples of myths and stories surrounding tattoo traditions in which people who were not tattooed would not be recognized by their ancestors in the afterlife. Instead, they would be destined to spend eternity in this sort of intermediate state, in this limbo. They would not be taken across the bridge, across the Milky Way to the longhouses of their ancestors. We find this in the Indian subcontinent. We find versions of it in native North America. We find versions of it in the Pacific and in other regions. So it's this really amazing cross-cultural myth about the value of tattooing in the afterlife. Tattoos were used as treatments, both medicinal and therapeutic, related to health and medicine. In some cases, like the Cayenne, tattoos were given specifically as sort of almost an acupuncture treatment, as a way to treat specific ailments, arthritis, specific diseases. In other cases, these treatments were more related to the cosmos and how people saw their space in the spiritual world. The Mentawai in Indonesia have this fantastic tradition in which they believe that sickness and death are the result of soul loss when the soul leaves the body. And the soul can choose to leave the body when it is unhappy. And so a way to keep the soul happy and in the body is to decorate the body, to make it beautiful through tattooing, through flowers, through tropical bird feathers and jewelry. And that will help prevent disease and sickness by keeping the soul happy and at home. And all of this ultimately ties into identity. Almost nowhere on earth is tattooing done for a single reason. Instead, it's multivalent. It draws from at least one, if not more, of these categories we've been discussing. And all of that rolls together to create these visual markers of identity, both for the individual and to the groups that individual belongs to. So even among the Chin groups in Myanmar, these are groups that speak the same language, that practice the same religion, but different villages have different tattoo patterns. And so based on an individual's tattoos, you can recognize that they are an adult, that they are a full member of society, what village they come from, and to a lesser extent, what village their parents came from. So this is all tied into identity. Now, of course, it's not all positive. There are certain societies around the world that use the absence of tattoos to signify group identity and to separate themselves from their tattooed neighbors. And in these settings, tattoos were a mark of the other. They were not something that was aspired to. They were something that was handed out as a form of punishment or dehumanization. Criminal tattooing was practiced both in Japan and in the UK. And in fact, in the UK, it wasn't outlawed until the late 19th century. Until that time, a deserter could be, they called it branded, but tattooed using this punch or a version of this punch that you see here. So we learn all of these things about tattooing from the historical record, but here's the thing. The historical record isn't always factual, right? A lot of histories were written centuries after the events they record. Some of them are written down by individuals who never actually visited the locations that they're describing. Some of them are outright fiction, written to engage the reader. The idea of history in the past does not match with how we consider history today. Also, tattooing extends about 200,000 years into the past, before the earliest written histories. So how do we investigate and understand tattooing in ancient pre-literate societies? Well, like any sort of non-written culture, we do it through archaeology. To me, as an archaeologist, tattooing is fundamentally interesting because we consider it to be permanent. It's a form of permanent body modification and of great importance to various societies, but that importance ends at death, at least in the archaeological record. And what is considered permanent culturally is at best intangible archaeologically. And so this has sort of driven me into this research rabbit hole, I guess, wherein I've landed on the front end of this thing that some people are calling tattoo archaeology, which I don't think is actually, I don't think that's actually a thing, but the fact of the matter is that we can use archaeology to answer specific questions about tattooing in the past. Was it practiced by specific ancient pre-literate societies? What roles did it play in those cultures? Can we tell how it developed, where it came from? Was it developed independently, or was it passed from other traditions down through time? How is it connected to other material cultural traditions, things like weaving or wood carving? And finally, what tools are used? And when we get at this archaeologically, there's basically three lines of evidence, which are art, bodies, and tools. And so we're going to kind of run through each of those. Almost all human cultures have created art depicting human, or let's say human-like bodies. The oldest depictions of body decoration are found on the oldest pieces of human-like art. So down in the lower right-hand corner of your screen is the Venus of Hofels from Germany, dates to about 40,000 years ago. It's one of the earliest pieces of art to look like a person. And you can't quite tell from this angle, but she is carved across her belly and across her breasts and down her arms with these deeply incised marks. Now, of course, the problem is that we don't know how to read ancient art by and large. We've not been left with instruction manuals. And so when we evaluate these pieces, it's hard to know if what we're looking at is tattooing or body painting or scarification, or these things may be depicting beings that aren't even human. This may not even be a real depiction of what humans are doing at this particular time in this particular culture. Sometimes we get really lucky and we have examples of tattooing traditions where marks appear on ancient art that then also appear historically and in traditions that continue to this day. So for example, in the American Arctic, the tattooing traditions of the Inuit and others go back to at least, I believe, 2,000 or 3,000 years BC, based on the artistic record. And those same marks were given historically, and those same marks continue to be given today by particularly women who are working to reclaim these traditions. Here in the Eastern Woodlands, we have the same sort of situation going on. We have art going back about 2,000 years to the woodland period of prehistory that depicts body decoration. In some cases, like in these famous head pots that you see on the right-hand side of the screen from the Mississippi River Valley, these intuitively seem to us to represent tattooing. In other cases, perhaps yes, perhaps no. There's I think a valid art historical debate about whether things that are incised might represent permanent body decoration, whereas things that are painted, for example, on the face of the wooden mask there from the Calusa in Florida, whether that might be instead showing temporary body modification or body painting. We honestly don't know the answer to that. Here in the Eastern Woodlands, we do have some direct connections. David Dye at the University of Memphis first made this comparison. The image on the left is a ceramic female effigy vessel from Mississippian culture, so about 1500 CE. And on its back and arms are incised these patterns and designs that match with the tattoos found historically on Osage women. And among the Osage, these designs were of cosmological significance. They centered the body in the cosmos. They acted to collect spiritual and cosmic energy and then channel that energy down the arms and into the tattooed spiders on the back of the hands, where then that energy was reinvested in the community in activities like agriculture and the preparation of food and childbirth. So moving on from art to the way that we can directly find tattooing in the archaeological record, which is mummies, both accidentally and deliberately preserved remains. By the late 19th century, tattooed human remains had been found at archaeological sites in Northern Africa and in the Andes. And here you see just one example of some fragments of tattooed skin from a cemetery in what is today Sudan. So Nubian culture, circa, as it says, about 1300 BC. These discoveries are very rare, but less rare than you might think. So one of my projects is I maintain this tattooed human mummies database. We're up to version 4 now. If you want to look it up online, you can get to it via this bit link. I have a couple of these bit links in the presentation, and I encourage you to take photos of them, or we can send them out afterwards. But when you type them in, be sure to use the capital letters after the bit.ly, otherwise you won't get there. In any case, right now in the database, we're up to several hundred individuals, plus sort of an indefinite number of additional discoveries from at least 70 archaeological sites all around the world. Now, the first version of this database was put together while back in 2016, some colleagues and I were trying to answer the question of what are the oldest tattoos? And by virtue of some radiocarbon chicanery and putting together this database, we were in 2016 able to publish a paper that conclusively identified that Otzi, the Iceman, is the world's oldest tattooed body. He was discovered 30 years ago this month, September 19th, I believe, 1991, washing out of a glacier or melting out of a glacier along the Italian-Austrian border. The photo to your left shows him the days after he was discovered when he was being exhumed from the ice. And to the right shows a reconstruction in the museum in Bolzano, where his remains are still kept today and studied, as well as then a list of all of his tattoos. He has 61 total tattoos on his body. Here to the left, you see a map of his body with all of the locations of those tattoos, and then some detailed images of them to the right. These have been directly sampled and examined under the microscope, and because of that, we know that they were made using a combination of soot and ash, probably from a campfire, based on the small inclusions of burned and pulverized stone that's included in them. It is broadly asserted online that Otzi's tattoos are medicinal or therapeutic. And a lot of people talk about how they align to acupuncture meridians and were used to treat his ailments. And this is probably at least partially true. Some of his tattoos do align to areas of his body where he suffered from arthritis or gallstones or whipworms or other ailments, but others do not. And one of the reasons that Otzi was originally identified as having non-representational tattoos was because, frankly, we don't know how to interpret these. I would submit to you that just because we don't know how to read an ancient art style doesn't mean that it was not symbolically important, and that it is probable and even likely that Otzi's marks did hold symbolic value to his culture and to him and the people that put them on his body. Spoiler alert, he's actually probably not the oldest tattooed mummy anymore. There have been some recent discoveries in Egypt that are still unpublished that I think may take away Otzi's crown. But for right now, until those come out, we'll say Otzi is the oldest, and he dates to about 3,500 or so BC. So as the human body is in the archaeological record, it weathers, right? It's exposed to natural forces, to moisture, to heat, to dry air, and the epidermis can change color and can darken. And what that does is it makes tattoos very difficult to see to the naked eye. And I think this is part of why there have been so few identifications of tattooed mummies to date. In the last 5 to 10 years, archaeologists have discovered that we can use a whole suite of digital imaging technologies in order to find and better document these tattoos. So one of my ongoing projects is not related at all to Tennessee archaeology, but focuses on tattooed Andean mummies from American museums. The earliest finds of tattooed mummies in Peru and in the Andes date to the late 1800s. And at that time, there was some debate as these remains were taken back to European and American museums about whether they were actually tattooed or whether what might be happening is it might just be body paint that preserved and mummified. We know today that these are in fact tattoos. And for the better part of a century, while these mummies were collected by foreign museums and put into museums in the Andes, they were treated mainly as curiosities. And there wasn't a lot of effort put into consistently recording or documenting their marks. And so I've undertaken this project to try to do so using modern technologies. I got started on this in 2019, so just in time for COVID to derail the entire thing and torpedo all of my travel. But I'm hoping to get going on it again soon. I did have a chance to visit a couple of collections along the way. And here you see an example of how I'm using these alternate imaging technologies. So on the left is a hand from Andean, Peru. On the top is in normal light, and on the bottom is taken with digital infrared. And you can see how much more visible that tattoo is. This is because these tattoos, along with most black tattoos in the ancient world, were created using carbon, charcoal or soot or ash. And carbon absorbs infrared light at a different rate than the untattooed human epidermis. And so this makes these tattoos stand out when you illuminate them in the correct infrared or near infrared wavelengths. On the right, you see a hand from a mummy from Cerro Colorado, Peru. And on the bottom is an example of not of infrared, but where we're using technologies that were developed elsewhere. I don't know if you all have ever heard of D-Stretch. It's a program that was created to document rock art. And what it does is it takes digital images and it basically analyzes clusters of pixels and color schemes, and then reprojects that image into a new color space that highlights things that are very faint or maybe completely absent. And so when using this program for rock art, you can see things like green and white pigments that might not be visible to the naked eye anymore. Well, using D-Stretch on mummified remains, we're able to do something very similar. And you see here this net pattern of tattooing on the back of this hand. So this project is also allowing us to, for the first time, make a real effort to identify commonalities between tattoos and motifs from material culture. And this, again, has not been consistently done before. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of overlap, which is not surprising because all around the world, the same patterns that go into tattoos go into other types of material culture. And so in the Andes, we're finding the same designs. You see this weaving at the bottom right with these birds, and then those same birds running down the pointer finger of the hand from Andean above it. We're also starting to look at the tattoos themselves using digital microscopes and try to recreate how they were made. I'm part of a research team that just received a grant from EXARC, which is the Experimental Archaeology Foundation. And what we're doing is we have recreated and used 8 or so non-electric traditional tattooing technologies and techniques and use them to tattoo ourselves. Specifically, Danny Ridde, who's a part of the team, who's a tattooist in Hamilton, New Zealand, has used them to tattoo multiple versions of the same design onto his body. And over the next 6 months or so, we're going to be monitoring how those different tattoos heal. And what they look like as the ink settles under the skin. And our hope is that we'll be able to compare those results with detailed imagery from mummies like the one you see here. So looking at this close-up of this hand from Andean, we believe that what we're seeing here is that it was created using the hand poke method, needle and chopstick, if you will. So put into the skin deliberately. And in working with Danny and several other professional tattooers, we think we're even getting a bead on how these things were created, the order in which we were created. And so in this case, we believe that we can differentiate between the solid lines that form the borders of the design and then the areas that were packed in with black, that were filled with black later. So a two-step process basically happening here. So the final way to investigate ancient tattooing is through artifacts, is through the tools used to mark the skin. And when you mention ancient tattooing to the public, most people think of this, these angle-hafted hand tap tools from the Oceania and the Pacific. The video on the left is a hand tap tattoo, me getting a hand tap tattoo by Durga in Indonesia a couple of years ago. Now, there are a couple of variations, a number of variations to how these tools are put together. To the right, you see 3 versions of this same basic tool from Fiji with different widths and different arrangements of points. The commonality among all these tools is that they are applied to the skin using a beater or a mallet, so hammered in indirectly. Hand tap tattooing and angle hafted tattoo tools are ancient. But they are not the oldest tattoo tools, and they're actually restricted to a fairly small geographic area on the global scale. There are as many types of tattooing tools as there are cultures who have tattooed, and the styles and the techniques and the implements, the material used to make the implements vary depending on time period, on region, on culture. They even vary between groups within the same culture. Most of them are made at least in part of biodegradable materials. And this, of course, presents a problem for archaeologists. We are at best able to find parts of tattoo tools in most cases. Things like those cactus spines in the upper left from Argentina may not survive at all in the archaeological record except in very specific circumstances. One of my ongoing projects is a book chapter for Oxford Press in which we're trying to broadly classify these different techniques of tattooing and to identify patterns around the globe. And our current map looks something like this. And so what you're looking at here, the green is hand poke. Again, if you want to think of this as needle and chopstick, it's any implement that's held in the hand, sorry about that, and applied to the skin directly. Tattooing by incision is just what it sounds like. It's when obsidian or metal is used to slice the skin and then pigment is rubbed in from the surface. Subdermal tattooing is this specific it's sort of catch-all that encompasses a couple of different, traditions in which the ink is not inserted directly into the skin, but is passed between 2 holes in the skin. So one example of this has been called skin stitching, in which a bone needle pulling a pigment-infused piece of sinew or thread is passed under the skin between 2 holes. And then hand tapping is the version that I've just showed you. Now, in a very few cases, particularly in the Pacific, we're able to connect archaeological data with tool types and thereby identify conclusively archaeological remains. So, for example, these bone tools in the lower right from Tonga are very old, 750 BC. They're some of the older conclusively identified tattooing tools. A couple of them are actually made from human bone, while some others are made from bird bone. But you see comparison to a historical Samoan tool there in the upper left, we can recognize these bone combs as being a specifically tattoo implements. Unfortunately, we have the problem of biodegradable materials that I already mentioned. We also have the problem in that in a lot of other regions on the earth outside of the Pacific, the tools used to tattoo, or the parts of tools that survive in the archaeological record, are visually similar or maybe even identical to other types of artifacts. And that makes them very difficult to identify directly. So, for example, a sharpened bone implement could be a needle, could be an awl, could be a corn husking pin, could be a cloak pin, could be used for tattooing. And what this means is that there are holes in our historical data. We know that the ancient Egyptians tattooed. We have historical evidence, we have artistic evidence, we have tattooed Egyptian mummies. But we don't yet know what tools or technique they use to make their tattoos. And this is the same all over the world. In the Andes and Western China, the tools and the techniques remain a big unknown. And a fair portion of my archaeological research has been devoted to this and falls under the umbrella of experimental archaeology. And for those of you who aren't aware, experimental archaeology is basically when archaeologists recreate and use tools from the archaeological record in order to learn about the past. My work is specifically focused on bone tools and learning to use them, or to make them, using pre-electric technology, so using stone tools, and then using them to tattoo. And the goal of this work has been to see if tattooing creates a unique microscopic wear pattern on the tips of tools. Every tool that you use, even today, when you use it, microscopic wear patterns form on it that vary depending on what material it's used on and how it's applied to that material. And so this work has been trying to get at whether we can identify patterns created by tattooing and differentiate those from other types of uses for bone tools. And then, if we can do that, can we then use those patterns to identify actual tattooing artifacts in the archaeological record? Now, we did most of the early stages of this work using pork skin, using pig skin. Pig skin is used a lot in forensic studies as a proxy for human skin because of its thickness and its elasticity. But along the way, we also had to ask the question, how do we know that tattooing dead pig skin leaves the same wear patterns as tattooing live human skin? And so this is kind of where it went off the rails. So this is me tattooing my own left wrist with a white-tailed deer bone tool in order to get at this. We looked at the tools before, during, and after tattooing. And as you can see in the scanning electron microscope images to the right, these are deer bone tools. There are discernible differences that occur as a tool is used to tattoo, and it occurs really relatively quickly. So this is after just 200 punctures. You can see the tip of that tool starting to round off and change. So in 2018, archaeologist Christian Gates St. Pierre, who's at the University of Montreal, identified the exact microwear pattern created by tattooing with bone tools. And he and his team, to do this, made a set of bone tools that you see here on the top. They used them to tattoo pig skin for up to an hour. And then they took images of them under the microscope before and at intervals and at the end. And ultimately, they were able to show that tattooing microwear is replicable and is different than wear created by actions like piercing hides. So we can, in fact, identify tattooing tools using this data. And Christian used this data set to identify this set of bone tools. This is from a Iroquoian village site in southern Quebec that dates to the 15th century. And he was able to determine that these specific tools have microwear consistent with tattooing. Specifically, what that means is that, that the microwear extends just 3 millimeters or so up the tips of the tool. Bone tools that are used for things like piercing hide or making clothes tend to have microwear extending 5 or 6 millimeters down the tip, and oftentimes associated with twisting motions, which we don't find on tattooing tools. So these bone implements from Quebec became the first definitively identified tattooing artifacts from pre-contact North America. So over the last couple of years, we've used these various techniques, these various imaging techniques and the data, the experimental data that we've generated with these studies to identify even older tattooing artifacts in North America. So we're going to turn now to the Southwest. And in that region, as you can see, all of these groups have a historical record of tattooing. Again, it's widespread. In that same region, we have art historical evidence of probable tattooing going back at least several hundred years, several centuries, as well as historical records of tattooing in Native American groups from the 15th through the late 19th century. Until recently, we had no idea what tools were used for this. Ethnographic data, including collections of museums like the Smithsonian, show us that cactus spines, and particularly prickly pear cactus spines, were preferred tattooing tools for much of the Southwest. And there have been some identifications of these archaeologically, like these tools from Aztec ruins. These were identified based on the intuition of the investigator, but have not been affirmed using use-wear or direct evidence. So it's still not clear that that's what's happening here. Now, in 2017, my colleague Andrew Gilworth Brown, who's a graduate student at Washington State University, was working on documenting a collection from excavations at the Turkey Pen site, which is in the Grand Gulch of Utah. This was until fairly recently part of Bears Ears. It was then carved out of Bears Ears along with a lot of other land. Hopefully it will be back in that protection soon. But in the 1970s, the site was badly looted. And so archaeologists went to the site to salvage data, to try to collect, not to do new excavations, but to face up the looters' pits and try to collect information from the spoil piles, basically to try to mitigate the damage that was done to the site. And that created this huge collection that then ended up at Washington State University. And Andrew, as part of his graduate work, was sorting this collection out. And in that collection, he found this little, amazing, unassuming tool. It is about 10 centimeters long. It's made from a sumac twig. And at the end, it has two prickly pear cactus spines that have been inserted into the pith of the twig and been wrapped with yucca fiber. And you can see there is black staining on the first couple millimeters of those tips. There are no similar artifacts, no artifacts like this in any collection in the American Southwest. This is absolutely unique as far as we could tell. Andrew and I worked together on archaeological work in Tennessee, and as he knew I was interested in tattooing, he called me up, he texted me some photos of this, and we put our heads together as to how could we prove that this was or was not used as a tattooing tool. And so we put together a research team that worked on this. And using various studies and technology, we were able to learn a lot about this tool. By doing elemental analysis, we showed that the black staining on the tip is carbon pigment. Probably not surprising, but here under the scanning electron microscope, you can actually see the individual pieces of crushed charcoal that make up that carbon that are embedded into the tip of, in this case, the shorter of the two spines. You'll notice that one of the two spines is shorter, but that it has pigment running across the top of it. We believe that that spine broke during use, and that after the tip of it broke, it continued to be dipped in pigment and applied to the skin for at least a couple of punctures, and that is why it has pigment across the top of it. We also did some experimental work replicating and testing this tool on pigskin, is what you see here. And we were able to show, as a result of this process, that the microscopic barbs that cover the tips of cactus spines entirely strip off within about the first 5 minutes of tattooing. And that sounds awful, right? But this fits with the artifact where there are no barbs visible on the surface. So here you see one of our experimental tools before tattooing and after just 5 minutes, where all of those barbs are stripped off. The video to your right looks bad. It looks really deep. It's not. That blob of pigment at the tip of the spines is only about 2 millimeters up their shaft. So this is very zoomed in, very, very far. The preservation at the site was incredible. And the same deposit included individual human hairs and turkey feces and all sorts of things that are datable using radiocarbon. And as a result, we have this tight span of radiocarbon AMS dates from the site that shows us that the tattooing tool was made and probably discarded between about AD 79 and 130, which evens out to about, let's say, AD 103. As a result of our experimental process, we could show that the microscopic wear patterns that formed on the tips of our experimental tools matched exactly those on the actual artifact. In fact, one of the spines on one of our experimental tools broke in exactly the same place in exactly the same way as the spine is broken on the actual artifact. So all of this together allowed us to identify this artifact as being the oldest direct evidence for tattooing in Western North America so far, at about AD 103. We published a study in 2019. We published it as open access. So using this bit link, you can actually get access to the entire study, which includes in the supplemental materials, a lot of our experimental work and microscope images. So this that I've shared with you tonight is some of what's been happening broadly in the world of tattoo archaeology in North America and beyond. We're going to be learning more in coming years. I have new studies in process. Colleagues have new studies in process. I mentioned that there's probably a mummy who's older than Otzi. Archaeologists are starting to look for evidence of tattooing more so than ever before. And there's going to be new discoveries and new artifacts and new mummies just around the corner, just over the horizon. We're going to be learning a lot more. If you're interested generally in this topic, Lars Krutak and I edited this volume, Ancient Ink, through the University of Washington Press in 2018. Already mentioned my Instagram account, Archaeology Inc. My colleague Ben Robitaille and I share information about ancient and historic tattooing and body modification on that Instagram feed. And also I've included here a bit link to academia.edu, which my page on academia.edu, which includes versions of most of my published papers on tattooing archaeology or archaeology in general. And so if you're interested in those things, I'd encourage you to check those out. And with that, thank you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so that I can see people and see the chat box. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That was fascinating. Does anybody have any question for Aaron? Oh, Rico, go for it.
Yeah, one of the photos that you showed of, I think it was John White's drawings, the patterns. Any significance with those patterns that you can tell us?
There absolutely is. The problem is we don't know what it is. So White did a great job illustrating the tattooing tradition, but he didn't actually ask anybody about it. And so there was no record at the time of who got those tattoos, why they got them, what they were specifically symbolic of. Now, there are Indigenous Native American scholars who are working real hard to reconnect with their tattooing traditions today. And they are coming up with increasingly being able to identify commonalities in their traditional material culture and tattoos seen in some of these images like John White's. And so come up with ideas as to what they may mean, but we don't have a hard and fast grasp on that, unfortunately.
Is there any evidence of other Eastern woodland tribes with tattooing traditions?
Oh, yeah. I mean, most, if not all of them. Pretty much from the 16th and 17th centuries, every European account of first coming into contact with a Southeastern tribe describes in passing that they had these marks on their body that would never go away. And it uses variations on that theme to describe them, but all throughout the Eastern woodlands and specifically in the Southeast. Yes, many, many.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Rico. And there's a question in the chat as well. I'll read it off from Lonnie. It says, you mentioned that colleagues are testing these tattoo methods. Have you tested any methods on yourself? If so, using what patterns?
Right. So I have accumulated a small collection of tattoos made using these implements that we've been recreating and experimenting with. I think it's sort of been a slippery slope. Like once you start making these things and testing them and are hanging out with tattoo artists as part of this, it's just a matter of time before someone's like, hey, you want to see what a cactus spine would feel like? And actually anecdotally, the cactus spines hurt less than steel needles when you're doing hand poke. That's very unscientific, right? But as far as the patterns involved, I have not gotten any traditional patterns done using those tools. I try to stay separate from things that Indigenous communities may feel strongly about not being on the bodies of people who are not of that community. And so my lines and things that I have put on myself hew most closely to Otzi. to the lines and crosses that Otzi has on his body. I don't know what we're calling that, Chalcolithic New Wave. I don't know. But that tends to be what I go in for.
All right, we have another question that just popped in the chat from Valerie. As a zooarchaeologist, I look at bone tools a lot. Is there any indication at the macro level that would suggest we should investigate a tool further to determine whether it was used for tattooing?
Yeah, so that's the big question, right? And one of my co-authors on a paper I just wrote recently on bone tools from Tennessee was Tanya Perez, who's a zooarchaeologist at FSU. And this was kind of what we were getting at in this paper, and actually in a lot of my research, is the fact that at the macroscopic level, an awl is a needle, is a punch, is a bodkin, and that once archaeologists take these things and call them an awl or a punch or a bodkin and put them into collections as such, it's very hard to reconstruct what they might actually be for. And so for my money, step one is the contextual case, right? Is finding a sharp implement. And there's all kinds of things in the archaeological record that can break the skin, and so can tattoo. But finding something that is directly associated with pigments or with pigment processing materials, I feel like that's the minimum threshold for trying to identify a tattooing artifact. And then from there, the gold standard becomes things like elemental analysis, and particularly then microwear, use wear.
That's very similar to a question I was going to ask you too, about how you decide which objects in museum collections you choose to sample or investigate further. Is it the tool assemblage, the site assemblage? Is it the time period? Is it the cultural group? Or with all the possible sharp things kicking around in museum collections, how do you decide what to focus on?
Yeah, all the sharp things and limited microscopes and funding, right?
Right.
And so, archaeologists have been identifying possible tattooing tools for over a century. But for the most part, that's been kind of intuitive. This is a sharp thing. I think it was maybe used to tattoo. And, that's great. And maybe they were, but it's not something that we can back up with replicable data. Mm-hmm. And so, that's where we kind of come into this process of like trying to figure out the contextual picture of the thing. In the case of those cactus spines from Utah, it was the fact that the tips were stained black and the extent of the staining on the tips, that it seemed to match with what we knew about the depth of penetration for bone tools when tattooing, being about 2 millimeters. And so that's what made us think we should investigate it more as being possibly a tattooing implement.
Yeah, as collections managers, all the things that you have in your collection that you kind of go, oh, wait, maybe we haven't been categorizing this correctly, or maybe we've been missing out on some descriptive data that could be useful to other researchers looking at different questions and we've been asking ourselves for the past while. Definitely brings up a whole bunch of questions when you're entering into kind of a new research field within archaeology.
And, and the historical data is really difficult to work with because particularly here in the Eastern Woodlands, the accounts, metal needles were introduced fairly early on to the Eastern Woodlands as trade goods from Europe. And those were taken into the tattooing traditions almost immediately, which makes a lot of sense intuitively, right? These are fantastic tools for tattooing. It's why we use them for tattooing today. But that process happened so rapidly that the traditional tools were abandoned and lost and forgotten about at this sort of critical juncture where there were also then all these acculturative forces coming in and suppressing or removing these traditions from native practitioners. And so in the historical record, you frequently find, an Englishman saying something about, they pierce their skin with great needles. Well, great, but what does that mean? Does that mean steel? Does it mean bone? Is it a needle is it a sharp thing that's hafted onto a wooden handle? Is it just a sharpened bone that's held in the hand? All of these other questions come up as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. All right, we are at 8:02, so almost exactly an hour since we started. Does anybody else have a question they would like to pose to Aaron while we have him here? If not, oh, Peter has a question. Go for it. Peter, you might have, there you go.
Hi there, sorry. I might have missed this. I came in a little late. Fascinating talk, thank you. I'm a person who has done research historically on tattoos, specifically at Japan. Wondering where you have found any evidence of the influence on native, indigenous, tribal tattoos in North America, influence on European tattoos, specifically among sailors, that we start seeing developing. I haven't seen too much in the 17th century. It seems like it starts off around the late 18th, early 19th century. And obviously they're very influenced by Japan by the mid 19th century. So just wondering if you see any evidence of North American indigenous culture on European sailor tattooing.
Not so. You may be familiar with the Seamen's Protection certificates. Have you heard of those? That's this set of documents that were designed to basically record and identify American seamen who might be captured or pressed into service on, vessels from other nations. And so in addition to their ages and names, one of the things they recorded was their tattoos. And in some cases, they would even go so far as to draw them instead of just writing like a love token, right? In other cases, they would actually draw, the Sacred Heart. But those things span from the 17th through the 18th century. And in them, we actually see very little shift in naval tattooing, despite this exposure to these other cultures. And you mentioned Japan, that's the exception, right? Once trade opens with Japan, there's this movement of Japanese style imagery, and even to a lesser extent, the tools and techniques into the maritime community. But earlier than that, you have some examples in the Americas of individuals being captured and adopted into tribes who are then marked with the tattoos of those groups. You have some examples of even, I believe, politicians being adopted into tribes and marked with those groups. But we don't see much of it heading back out on the ships towards Europe until much later on. It's an interesting thing about how resistant those European traditions were, and that's what's led us to believe that they were in place for a good long time prior to these colonial encounters.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I do have one more quick question for you, if that's all right. When you're looking at the iconography of prehistoric or pre-contact cultures, in particular the ceramics, do you ever worry, or how do you distinguish between tattooing and scarification?
That is a great question, right?
Right.
That is frankly why we can't rely on the art historical record to know for certain when people were and weren't tattooing. Ancient Egypt presents us a great example of this. We know now, as of the last decade, we've discovered these incredible things about tattooing in ancient Egypt, and are finding that at least in some places at some times, it appears that most women were actually tattooed. But when you look at Egyptian imagery, for example, tomb paintings, you see the bodies of people on display without any tattoos on them. And so there's this disconnect between, what is happening in real life and what may be happening in art that's deemed political or sacred or special. And differentiating between scarification and tattooing is really difficult. Basically, I think the only way to do it for certain is to be able to connect it to a specific historical tradition that we have photographs or written records or specific accounts of.
Really focusing on those multiple lines of evidence.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. All right. Does anybody else have a question they would like to ask of Aaron? If not, I would like to thank you all for coming out to this lecture tonight. It certainly was fascinating. We have some great comments in the chat here. Much appreciation from everybody who attended today. So thank you, Aaron, for joining us. Our lecture series is sponsored by the Friends of Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. Your support of the Friends of JPPM allows us to offer so many of our programs at no charge. If you're interested in becoming a member, please check out their website at www.friendsofjppm.com. Please join us next month in person at JPPM for a talk by Patrick Wilkinson. He is an anthropologist at both St. Mary's College and the University of Wyoming, who will tell us about his research on the practice of voodoo and the use of caves in voodoo in Haiti. Also coming up in the next month at the park, we have a solid lineup of wonderful workshops and events, details for which can be found on our social media and website. We have some guided sunset hikes that are coming up, offered each Thursday evening in October. We have Foraging Nature's Bounty, which is part of our Evening Ecology series on October 8th, where we'll be walking some of the woodland trails and behind the park and gathering up some of those wonderful edible fruits that are about ready to ripen up and be consumed. I think we're actually going to eat some of these things too, so it'll be good. We also have the last village day of the season, which is Saturday on October 16th, which is a free drop-in all day. You get some demos at the Woodland Indian Village at the park. And we have 2 workshops in October, Historical Cooking on October 16th and Friction Fires on October 20th. And with that, thank you again, everybody, for coming out. If you have any questions for Aaron, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, you have Deb's email probably, so you can send them to her. And have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.